Andrew, absolute pleasure to have you on the Damhurst podcast.
Likewise, Olivia Guy, pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming. And I think what would be really good for our listeners is if you could tell us a little bit about you and how you even came to be in the insurance market and a brief overview of your journey.
Yes, certainly. So I was born in Ghana, which is West Africa, but only stayed there for about 9 months. Both my parents were diplomats. My father was a doctor gynecologist, and my mother was also in the medical profession. So they moved around quite a fair bit. So from the ages of 9 months till 9 years, we lived in several countries, mostly in Africa, West Africa. So I recall the Gambia, Senegal, Liberia, Malawi, South Africa.
Oh, wow.
So what that built was adaptability, because literally every year you're making new friends, leaving new old friends, making new friends. So you have to be quite resilient, being able to blend in. And then at the age of 8.5, my parents made the decision to relocate to the UK. Hence my English accent, UK education. But, I actually, believe it or not, wanted to be a medical doctor.
Wow.
Follow my father's footsteps. And so I did the sciences for A-levels, and I got into med school.
Oh, wow.
But 2 months before I was due to start, I did work experience in hospital, and I saw blood for the first time in a live situation, and I fainted. So dusted myself off, went home, came back the next day, same thing happened again. It was A&E trauma. And so my dad said, son, I don't think this is for you.
Yeah.
So 2 months before university starts, had to really think what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I was always quite fascinated by business programs on TV. I never really understood what they were talking about, but I was fascinated. So I decided to do an economics degree.
Mm-hmm. And was that quite, if you had thought your path was going to go one way and then actually through a visceral reaction against it, was that quite unnerving, or did you take it kind of in
Well,
stride?
I was so young at the time, I just took it in my stride.
Yeah.
It's something I'll talk about later, which is resilience and adaptability. So, went to university, got an economics degree, graduated, and then trained to be an accountant. Not really knowing what I wanted to do post-qualification, I, like all people did back then, I joined an investment bank. Warburg, Dillon Reed, or UBS, as it's known, was a banker for several years, largely in financial institutions. And then I moved over to Credit Suisse, again, financial institutions. And at that stage, I had been advising clients across insurance, asset management, wealth management, and thought it'd be more fun not to be the advisor, but to be the decision maker. So I made my first move into industry with a company called Old Mutual, which was a FTSE 100 insurer. And my role was de facto, it started off as financial controller of the US business, which morphed into the financial director of the US business.
Were you in the US at this point, or were you?
Well, it was quite an interesting role, though, because it was half based in London,
Okay.
half based in the US. And the US had 3 sites, Boston, Baltimore, and New York.
Yeah.
And then literally within, I would say, a year or so of joining, the financial crisis of 2007 happened, at which point the US business almost sank the ship, as it were. And I was asked by the board to take over the troubled unit in Bermuda, which had lost, I believe, $1.3 billion. And that started my management role in insurance. So, I'm often asked the question, did you choose to be in insurance? And I tell you what, Guy, Olivia, I've never met anyone that makes a deliberate, conscious decision to be in insurance. But in my case, I was just so keen to switch from being a banker to being in industry. And the first interesting opportunity I got was with Old Mutual.
Yeah,
and that's because it allowed me to travel, see the world a little bit. And it was fascinating.
And how's that? Can you talk about how your executive career kind of evolved from there, and then sort of maybe more importantly, interested in how because you're relatively young when you took on a sort of non-exec portfolio career. So just interested in how your career evolved from Old Mutual Bermuda into where you are.
So Old Mutual Bermuda was what we would call a turnaround story.
Yeah.
It had lost a lot of money, and it was literally a fix-it job, which was to recapitalize the business, stabilize the business, deal with a lot of complex hedging issues, and that took a couple of years to fix and stabilize that, which the team in which I was responsible for did, and that earned me a bit of a reputation as a turnaround specialist. Towards the end of my time there, the group chief executive of Old Mutual had left Old Mutual and gone to Sunlife, where he became the group chairman of Sunlife. And Sunlife, again, similar global insurance business headquartered in Toronto. And I kept in contact with him. And he said, "Look, Andrew, we are looking for somebody to come and lead our international business. We want to leverage much more of the center. It operates in numerous jurisdictions all over the world. Would you mind coming to Toronto and talking to the team?" So I did. And I was offered the role of the chief executive of the international business. 34 countries,
Wow.
a lot of product lines. Did that for a few years. And again, that was a very different challenge because that wasn't fixing a broken business. This was how do you grow a business internationally, leveraging the center in Toronto, although it was based primarily, its head office in Bermuda for, I would say tax reasons, because that wouldn't be the most efficient answer.
Yeah.
But for efficiency reasons,
Yeah.
as an organization. And by that stage, so I took on my first chief exec role at the age of 32, 33.
I didn't quite realize it was as young as that.
Yeah. And, I've been running Old Mutual, Sunlife for a number of years.
Yeah.
And when you're running divisions of global businesses, you always one day hope you can be the group chief executive or the number one, so to say. And then I was approached by one of the headhunters, no names mentioned. And they said, "Look, we've got a really interesting opportunity. It's a growth story, and they want somebody with international experience that can internationalize a largely South African business.
Okay.
It's Africa's largest investment manager, insurer, asset manager, and it's based in Johannesburg."
Okay.
Bit of a wild card because I'd been to Johannesburg before as a tourist, but went there, met the team, met the board, and ultimately concluded with my family's support that I would take on the role as group chief executive of Alexander Forbes, which was listed. So it was a step from being a divisional chief executive of a Fortune 100 business, and it was large institutional names that owned the business. And the whole premise was Africa was an emerging continent, a growing middle class that needed pensions, insurance, retail products, wealth products. And the idea was to expand that beyond South Africa and move it into the continent of Africa. And it had operations in the UK as well. So I did that for a fair few years.
What was it about your approach, your background? How did you position yourself? What do you think helped you get that role so young?
It's a good question, but I've always said that where the challenge was most acute, you don't really get many volunteers.
Okay.
I volunteered myself
Put your
because
hand up.
What's the worst thing that could happen? At best, you could succeed. At worst, you fail, but you're expected to fail.
True.
But for even trying, you get noticed. And, when I started out and I looked at senior leaders and board directors, I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me.
Yeah.
So there was no reference point. There was no role model to look up to. So I thought actually, you know what? Unless I make myself stand out, the chances of me succeeding aren't that great. So it was a conscious decision to take on the most difficult projects that nobody wanted to do. And I did so. And I worked twice as hard.
And what do you think gave you the confidence to do that? Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to consciously put my hand up for the most difficult assignments. Easy to say, hard to do. What? There's a steeliness there. There's a confidence there in order to put yourself in that position in the first place.
I think it comes back down to a little bit of my childhood in the sense of when you move countries so often, you learn to be resilient, you learn to be tough, you learn to be quite sociable, and you learn to be a very quick study of character. And I think all those traits blended together, which said to myself, actually, you know what, I'm not going to accept no for an answer. And it actually put me in good stead though, because I was able to take on lots of interesting projects, lots of interesting assignments. And as they became more successful, I built up a support base of supporters that would vouch for me, including, as I mentioned, the previous chief executive of Old Mutual, who was critical in me getting both the Sunlife role and the Alexander Forbes role.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really interesting in these conversations. It's becoming clear that having a mentor or someone who believes in you in your career really helps.
It does, yes.
Did you ever, upon taking on those jobs, either your first CEO at 3132 or the group CEO, ever question yourself? Or if you did, how did you swallow those creeping doubts?
I think it's only natural for your first chief executive role. You kind of suffer a little bit of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And you say to yourself, well, am I really here? Is this a dream? And then you have to pinch yourself and say, actually, it's true, I'm here. But then you kind of learn on the job. And the most important thing is a fable my grandmother always said to me: you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So it's very important to listen and not jump to conclusions or decisions, but assess the mood, judge character, build a trust base, and then be very clear on the vision, i.e. the North Star, be very clear on the culture needed, the strategy, and the governance. And once you kind of have those 3 aligned, irrespective of the company or the business, that's how you deliver success. And building a very strong rapport with your management team and your board of directors.
Several years at Alexander Forbes, transitioning into that from exec to non-exec.
Yep.
What was the motivation there? Because that was, as far as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, relatively young to sort of transition from exec to non-exec.
Yeah, I was 44.
Yeah.
When I decided to step down from exec life, and it was driven by a couple of things. So most people, as you quite rightly point out, don't reach chief executive until, say, their 40s. So by the time you've done 12 years on the treadmill, you're in your 50s.
Yeah.
I started in my early 30s. So 12 years plus, I was 44. And it does take a toll on you in terms of the 100-hour weeks. And it wasn't just the 100-hour weeks, it was the global travel.
Yeah.
Across 4 continents for 10 years. And that places a toll on your body and your mind and your family life. So I felt it was just a different emphasis to shift to do something else. And the idea was to, relocate back to London, because I'd left London, 15 years prior. Had stints in New York, in Boston, in Toronto, in Johannesburg. And the idea was to come back to London, settle back into London, and frankly, not do much for a year or so. I think that lasted all of 6 weeks before I started with Helios, which was a private equity firm.
Yeah.
And then over the last 7 years, I've built up quite a broad portfolio.
Mm-hmm. And how did you find that transition from actually, being the ultimate driver of a business to actually having to sit on your hands, influence rather than direct?
The first year, I would say, was the most challenging, because the role of any director on a board is not to direct, but it's to make sure there's a cohesive, coherent strategy. There's a strong management team, and there's appropriate governance, and you both challenge and support. So rather than saying this is what you have to do, it would be, well, here's some perspective on how I've seen this problem before, but leave it up to the management team to come up with ideas to execute. So the first year or so was the toughest challenge in learning the rule, so to say, of being a director, as opposed to being the driving force. But I think being a chief executive actually helped, because I was able to see questions and thoughts and analyze it from the vantage point, what would I have done? And then how would I then distill that into a supportive framework for management to think about? Because sometimes, management may be seeing that challenge or issue for the first time. And, chances are I've probably seen it before, maybe in a different context, but to be able to give perspective, I think, is quite important.
Did you always have the ambition, the aspiration to be a leader, or was it something that just either came naturally or just happened?
I don't think anything just happens for a reason. I think you've got to work at it. And, like I say, I never saw people that looked like me in senior positions, either at management level or board level, when I started out in this industry 30 plus years ago. So I always thought to myself, why not? So that was a driving force. And I think that's probably what propelled me to take on the most challenging assignments, the most difficult assignments, and push myself twice as hard, because I knew failure would be a step back, not just for me, but for the next generation.
Those values learnt in childhood that perhaps have enabled you to be where you are today. You touched upon your upbringing of moving around and the resilience, but any other core kind of lessons learned?
I think leadership today is all about adaptability. I mean, the world is so uncertain. It's about grit, because there will be good days, bad days, and resilience. So if you can be adaptable, have determination, grit, and a strong sense of resilience, but also be a decent human being. Because actually, one thing I've learned is that people actually don't remember what you said to them, but they remember how you made them feel. So as a result of that, the way you make people feel is far more important than what you actually say. So there's got to be transparency, there's got to be trust, and there's got to be openness. So it doesn't matter how tough or hard the message is. They've got to believe what you're saying is sincere and truthful, because they'll remember that as opposed to the message. So, that's the one lesson I've learned, in that when I took on my first chief exec role, maybe it was situational, but the company was in crisis. So it's much more what I would call a command control.
Yeah.
So in other words, this is what you have to do, just do it. But by the time you kind of move on to your third chief exec role and being a board director, it's less about this is what you have to do. It's more about getting a group of people, i.e. the company, to be supportive of a new direction. And that takes a lot of time to build up that trust and that momentum, that transparency, and that desire to change, because humans don't like change, particularly in the corporate world.
No, definitely. And failure nowadays, sort of framing failure as kind of lessons learned, or with hindsight, I would have done it differently. What's been your biggest failure as a leader, and what have you learnt from that you would do differently?
If you're very fortunate enough to work in a global context where you're dealing with different cultures, if I had to do it again, I would have spent much more time truly trying to understand and embrace those cultures. And I'm not going to stereotype one culture over another, but I would say that certainly in the UK or the US, there's a certain style of doing business which you just assume transcends the world. It doesn't. And it creates friction and frustration with colleagues in other parts of the world, because that's not how they do business or how they are, because they have a different culture. So, but unfortunately, when you're running global businesses, you don't really have time to learn the culture or study the culture. But I question that the most successful people are the ones that understand people, understand cultures, can relate to those cultures. And as a result, those individuals from different backgrounds and circumstances, they trust you more. They have better empathy with you. And actually you can get a lot of stuff done in the right way. So what I would say is that, as somebody who's been fortunate enough to live and work on several continents, I often think about countries and continents I've been to, and I ask myself, do I really know the culture there? And probably the answer is still no.
Yeah.
So that's my one regret.
What do you think are some of the challenges facing industry leaders today, and how do you think leaders should be thinking about overcoming?
Well,
for
I
those
think
challenges?
the strength of any business is the robustness of its strategic plan. Challenges such as working from home,
Mm-hmm.
um, it becomes quite tough to take a truly long-term view on any business, and by default, you tend to start to think about in 18-month sprints,
Mm.
which frankly is not very helpful.
Yeah.
You're trying to run a long-term business, or if you're in an industry that has a 7-year cyclical cycle. So it becomes much more difficult for both management and board to operate when there's so much uncertainty on multiple levels.
And in terms of the industry at large in the next 5 years, you've mentioned at the start, when you were at the start of your career, you were somewhat acutely aware that there weren't many who looked like you in leadership positions, and in a way that really propelled you forward. D&I has been a topic in the industry for, particularly in the past 5 years.
Yep.
Where do you think as an industry we need to be positioning ourselves in order to make sure that we've got, the best but also diverse talent, and that we're attracting people from lots of different
Unfortunately, this might
places?
sound a bit draconian, but it starts off with setting clear targets for the industry, and linking those targets to compensation. Otherwise, it won't get done.
Yeah.
So I think, Lloyd's were very clear in terms of some of the diversity targets it set the industry. And as a result, you saw tremendous progress being made in meeting those diversity targets. But it also requires brave leadership to essentially entrust your teams to look at diverse pools of talent and not necessarily stick to the same pools of talent. So certainly at one of the companies I'm involved in, there is a desire to work with inner city schools in the Tower Hamlets district to find talent and expose them to the Lloyd's of London market in ways they would never ever see in their lives. And actually that sparks something in them to be really interested in it, go to university and come back. So I think it requires a broad range of initiatives at the grassroots level, but also setting targets for the industry to follow.
What are your thoughts on how to be a brave leader? How can you sort of quantify?
Yeah, well, I think without mentioning any names of the consultancies, but I think there have been several studies from the consultancies which say that diverse workforces generate better returns, are more efficient, and have better retention. And that's because actually the workforce replicates the society individuals live in.
Yeah.
And I think that's been proven by many numerous research projects. But it requires a level of being brave by a leader, because actually the easiest thing for any leader is to pick individuals from the same breeding grounds historically.
Yeah.
But it takes a brave leader to say, you know what, that's the past.
And what advice would you give to young people coming into the market today that have aspirations, ambitions to be a 31-year-old CEO and maybe a chair, non-exec kind of later in life?
I've always had the view that don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to take on different challenges. If you start out in finance, don't assume you'll be in finance your entire career. Similarly, if you start out in operations or IT or sales, don't be afraid to switch and learn about different segments or sectors within your company, because actually, as you get more senior, you'll be able to translate the strategic vision into language those individuals in those various functions can understand. So I would say, don't be afraid to explore. Don't silo yourself too soon. The role of a general manager is the word general, which means you've got a broad overview of everything.
Building on from that, we as a business often see people who are reaching a point in their executive career where actually they're really thinking about going plural. How best, in your experience, what advice would you give to those people?
It's all about the network you have. So sometimes, it's very easy as an executive to forget to build a network. That's the most crucial thing, because fundamentally when it's time to switch from exec to non-exec, yes, search firms are tremendously helpful. But actually, it's the behind closed doors discussion that goes on at the selection panel, which says, right, we've got a short list of 3 or 4 people. Does anyone know anyone? And all it requires is somebody to say, yep, I know that person. I know somebody who knows that person. They're good. And that's the decision. Yeah. Irrespective of the brief from the search firm, it's about personal relationships. So I would say that, build networks, build relationships, invest in those relationships, invest in the network, because you never know when it'll be helpful for you. And I think making the transition to your very first NED role requires a tremendous amount of networking. And, some people spend 2-3 years just trying to land the first one.
Yeah.
And once you've landed the first one, it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah.
Because then you can build on that network. But it's trying to get the first one that quite
always
challenging.
Seems to be the case. Yeah, it's just getting that first one, and then the rest can sort of snowball.
Yeah, but again, it's all about that network. If you've got an incumbent chair, or you've got incumbent board of directors or individuals who know you, they can always keep their ear to the ground in terms of opportunities that are arising, and have a discreet word with whoever's running the search on the company side. And you'll be amazed how influential that could be.
100%. And just penultimate question, your MBA, how influential, how important, how useful has that been for you, and potentially opening doors?
So I would say it's dependent on the school you choose.
Okay.
So there are very good schools out there that are predominantly finance focused. So if you want to enter the financial services industry as a sector specialist in a certain area, there's certain schools for you. But if you want a generalist experience, which is less so on the finance, but much more on the organizational behavior, the leadership characteristics, again, there's certain schools. So when I was choosing my MBA, I didn't necessarily want a specialist finance school because I was already an accountant. But I wanted a school that focused a lot more on leadership and what I call organizational behavior, i.e. culture. And, I'm actually amazed that one of the highlights of my MBA was an elective called crisis management.
Okay.
And you'll be thrown into a real life crisis as a leader, and it's recorded on cameras, and you'd have to essentially save the company or articulate a vision for managing the crisis. And, you go through this thinking, oh, this is never really going to happen to me.
Yeah.
But in my case, it did. And I was actually able to rely on the tips I got from that session, even though it was, 10-15 years prior to that. So I would say the value of an MBA is about the relationships you develop from your fellow pupils, but also from the experiences you share. If you ask me about a particular module or elective, I couldn't tell you. Couldn't tell you. But if I'm presented a challenge, I know where to look for the answers. So it gives you the innate ability to ask probing questions in the right way. So I would say the value of an MBA is the ability to think broader.
Okay.
Which I think is helpful.
And it's, to bring it full circle, it's allowed you to understand those business programs that you maybe didn't post-medical school.
Indeed.
And final question, Andrew, we ask our guests, if you're, getting on the tube, going into a board meeting, and you're needing a song to motivate you and get you pumped for that meeting, what's your go-to song of choice?
Oh, without question, it's Get On Your Feet by Gloria Estefan.
Oh.
Okay.
And because I think the lyrics are quite interesting. It says, get on your feet and make it happen.
Okay.
Very good, yeah.
So in other words, stop procrastinating.
Yeah.
Get on with it and go make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you need that mindset when either in doubt or maybe thinking about the self-imposter syndrome. You just need to get on your feet and make it happen.
It's an amazing
way to wonderful way to end it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Andrew,
My
thank
pleasure.
you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.